What does cold truly mean? Not the chill you feel stepping from your car to your heated home, but cold as a living presence, cold that shapes every thought, every movement, every breath you take for months without end. Tonight, we drift back to a world where winter was not an inconvenience, but a season of quiet survival, where families huddled in log cabins on the northern frontier of the 1800s, where the simplest tasks, fetching water, keeping a fire alive, making it through one more frozen night, required a kind of resilience we can barely imagine now. Before we step into this hushed journey through winter's hold on those early frontier families, I'd like to ask a small favor. If you'd tap the like button and subscribe to Epic Boring History, you'll always find your way back to these late-night passages into forgotten corners of the past. Leave a comment if you'd like. Tell me where you're listening from, what hour it is for you right now. Some of you may be awake in the deep stillness of night, others just beginning your day, or somewhere in that quiet space between. Now perhaps dim the lights, maybe let a gentle fan hum in the background, and let's settle into tonight's slow journey through history. The northern wilderness of the 1800s was a place of extremes, along the edges of the Great Lakes, across the Canadian Shield, and into the subarctic reaches where settlement thinned to almost nothing. Families made their homes in a landscape that demanded everything and forgave little. They came for land, for opportunity, for the promise of something their own. What they found was a world measured in cords of wood, in frozen breath, in the space between sunset and the long, long night. Imagine yourself there, in a one-room cabin you helped build with your own hands, somewhere along the remote edge of the northern frontier. The year might be 1847 or 1853 or 1862. The date matters less than the season, and the season that matters most is winter. It arrives in early October, sometimes late September. One morning, you wake to find the world transformed, a thin layer of frost coating everything, the air sharp enough to make your lungs ache, and you know with a certainty that settles into your bones that this cold will not truly leave until April, perhaps May. Your cabin sits among towering pines and bare birches. The nearest neighbor lives half a day's walk away, and in winter that distance might as well be the width of an ocean. The silence here is profound, not peaceful, exactly, but immense, broken only by the occasional groan of trees contracting in the cold or the distant crack of ice forming on the lake. You built your cabin from logs, each one felled and dragged and notched by hand. Between the logs you stuffed moss, clay, anything to keep the wind from slicing through. But the cabin breathes anyway. Small drafts find their way in, sneaking through gaps you cannot see, making the candle flame dance even when the door is closed tight. The roof is made of split logs covered with bark and sod. On cold nights you hear it pop and crack as temperatures plunge, the wood contracting, the frost working its way through every seam. Sometimes snow drifts through the chimney when the wind shifts, hissing into the fire below. This single room must serve every purpose. Sleeping, cooking, working, shelter. All of life compressed into a space perhaps 15 feet by 20. During the worst storms, you bring the animals inside too. A cow, if you're fortunate, chickens huddled in a crate, their body heat, another small gift against the cold. Water freezes in the wooden bucket you keep beside your bed. Each morning, you wake to find a skin of ice across its surface, sometimes thick enough that you must break it with the handle of a spoon. Your breath forms clouds in the darkness when you rise, and for a moment before you move, you lie there, gathering the will to leave the warmth of your blankets. The fire died sometime in the night. It always does. You banked it carefully before sleep, covering the coals with ash to preserve them, but the cold is relentless and the logs burn down to nothing, no matter how you try to stretch them. So you rise in the dark, your feet meeting the shock of the cold floor, packed earth in some cabins, rough planks in others. Your fingers are stiff immediately, clumsy as you reach for the tinderbox. Striking flint in the cold is an art. The metal seems reluctant, the spark more hesitant, and your numb fingers make every movement uncertain. Finally, a small flame catches in the nest of dried grass and bark you prepared the night before. You feed it carefully, small twigs first, then larger pieces, nursing it back to life with the patience born of necessity. The fire is not just warmth, it is life itself, the difference between enduring and surrendering. As the fire grows, you can begin the day's first task: water. The creek lies some distance from the cabin, and in winter it becomes a treacherous journey. You pull on your boots, stiff leather, or hide that froze overnight, requiring you to work your feet into them like forcing frozen wood into a joint. Outside, the cold hits you like a physical force, not the momentary chill of stepping outside in modern winter, but a deep, penetrating cold that finds its way through every layer of clothing, that makes your eyes water and your nose run and your lungs burn with each breath. The snow might be knee-deep, might be waist-deep after a storm. You follow the path you broke yesterday and the day before and the day before that, the same route worn into the snow by endless repetition. Each step requires effort, lifting your legs high, placing each foot carefully so you don't break through a weak spot into deeper drifts. The creek, when you reach it, is frozen solid. You carry an axe for this purpose, and now you must find a spot where the ice might be thinner, near where water still moves beneath if you're lucky. The axe rings against the ice, each blow reverberating through the frozen air. And slowly, so slowly, you break through. Water surges up through the hole, dark and startlingly alive. You dip your bucket quickly before ice begins forming at the edges again. The water is so cold it makes your teeth ache, even though you haven't drunk it yet. The journey back is harder. The bucket is heavy now, and you must walk carefully to avoid spilling. Every drop is precious, and you won't make this trip again until tomorrow. Water sloshes against the sides, and by the time you reach the cabin, ice has begun forming around the rim. Inside again, you can finally begin preparing something resembling breakfast. Your stores are limited, have been limited since December, will remain limited until spring. Dried beans, perhaps, soaked overnight, and now ready to boil. Salted pork, the same salted pork you've eaten for months, the taste so familiar it barely registers. A handful of ground grain, if you're fortunate, made into a thick porridge that at least fills your stomach. There is no fresh produce, no vegetables, no fruit, nothing green or crisp or alive. You ate the last of the root vegetables in January, potatoes, turnips, carrots, stored in the root cellar dug beneath the cabin floor. Now there is only what keeps, dried, salted, smoked, preserved in any way that defeats time and rot. You think about food constantly, not with the sharp pang of starvation, though that is a fear that never quite leaves, but with a dull, gnawing awareness of deficiency. Your body craves things you cannot name, nutrients it needs and cannot find in your monotonous diet. Your gums bleed sometimes when you wake. Your skin feels papery and strange. After breakfast, the day's true work begins. Wood. Every single day without exception, you must cut wood. This is the iron law of winter survival. Wood is warmth, and warmth is life, and the cold is patient, and will happily reclaim you the moment you stop feeding the fire. You venture out again, this time with axe and saw. The woodpile is never large enough, never quite sufficient to ease your anxiety. You have been cutting since autumn, felling trees and splitting logs, but winter is long and the fire is hungry, and there is always need for more. The trees stand frozen, their trunks so cold the axe bounces off them at first, reluctant to bite. You choose trees carefully, dead ones when possible as they're drier and burn better, though even dead trees are frozen solid now. Each swing of the axe sends shocks up your arms, and the impact makes a sharp, ringing sound quite unlike the thick thunk of summer woodcutting. When a tree finally falls, it drops into the snow with a muffled crash, sending up a white cloud. Now comes the work of limbing it, cutting it into manageable lengths, dragging those lengths back toward the cabin. Your lungs burn with the effort, your breath coming in great frozen clouds, ice forming in your beard if you're a man, on your scarf if you're a woman. Back at the cabin, you split the logs. This is harder than it sounds. Frozen wood is stubborn, and the splitting maul must be placed exactly right to make the wood crack apart. Your hands, despite heavy gloves or mittens, begin to ache from the cold and the vibration. The axe handle, no matter how smooth you've worn it, raises blisters that break and bleed and freeze. Hours pass this way. The sun, when you can see it through the clouds, traces a low, short arc across the southern sky, barely clearing the treetops before beginning its descent. Winter days are startlingly brief this far north, and you must make use of every moment of daylight. Your clothing is a constant compromise. You need to stay warm, but you also need to move, to work, to function. So you wear layers, a shirt of rough wool or linen, another shirt over that, perhaps a vest, a coat made of hide or thick wool, and over everything a heavy cloak or blanket worn like a poncho. On your head, a hat pulled low, a scarf wrapped across your face, leaving only your eyes exposed. But wool, once wet, stays wet. And you sweat despite the cold, from the exertion of chopping, hauling, splitting. That sweat freezes in your clothing, creating uncomfortable patches of ice against your skin. At night, you hang these garments near the fire to dry, and they fill the cabin with the smell of damp wool and wood smoke and human toil. Your boots are perhaps your most precious possession. Leather or hide, carefully greased with tallow to keep them waterproof, though nothing truly keeps the damp out. Each night they freeze solid, and each morning you must soften them by the fire before you can force your feet inside. The soles wear thin, and you patch them with extra layers of hide, knowing that a boot that fails in winter can mean losing toes, losing a foot, losing your life. When darkness falls, and it falls early, so early, you retreat inside for the night. This is both relief and trial. Relief because you can finally rest, finally stop the constant motion that survival demands. Trial because the night is long, so long, and there is little to fill it but darkness and cold and the endless crackle of the fire. You eat again, the same simple food as before. Perhaps you've managed to catch a rabbit in one of your snares, and tonight there is fresh meat, a luxury that makes the evening feel almost festive. Or perhaps not, and it's beans and pork again, the same as always. After eating, there is mending to do. Clothes wear out quickly under constant use, and you sit by firelight with needle and thread, patching holes, reinforcing seams. Your fingers are clumsy in the dim light, and you squint at your work, trying to make the stitches even. Perhaps you have a book, one precious book, brought from wherever you came, now read so many times you know every page. Or perhaps you have no book, and the evening passes in silence, broken only by the fire and the wind outside, and perhaps a few words exchanged with whoever shares this small space with you. If you have children, they grow restless during these long winter months. There is nowhere to run, nowhere to play, nothing to do but exist in this small room day after day. They forget what green looks like, what warm feels like. They develop a kind of pallor, a quietness that worries you more than you admit. Your spouse, if you have one, becomes both comfort and source of tension. You love them, of course you love them, but months of confinement in such close quarters reveals every small annoyance, every difference in habit and temperament. You learn to be patient, or you learn to step outside for a moment even when it's freezing, just to have space, just to breathe alone. As night deepens, you begin preparing for sleep, the most critical preparation of the day. The fire must be banked carefully, coals buried in ash, to preserve them through the night. You've learned through hard experience that letting the fire die completely means a miserable morning, struggling to restart it with frozen fingers. Around the cabin's base, you've heaped earth and snow, primitive insulation that helps, but only helps. The cold still finds its way in, seeping up through the floor, down from the roof, through those invisible gaps in the walls. Your bed is whatever you could manage, a frame of rough wood with ropes stretched across, or simply a platform built against the wall, piled with whatever soft things you possess. Straw if you have it, dried grass, pine boughs. Over this, blankets, wool if you're fortunate, and over the wool, hides. Buffalo robes if you were able to trade for them, bear skins, deer hides, anything with fur to trap warmth. You sleep in your clothes. Removing them would mean unbearable cold, so you keep everything on, sometimes adding extra layers for the night. You sleep with others too. Crowding together for warmth is not intimacy but necessity. Children nestle between parents, siblings pressed close, everyone seeking everyone else's heat. Even so the cold reaches you, your nose grows numb, your ears ache. You pull the blankets over your head, creating a small cave of warmth around your face, breathing in the close air. Frost sometimes forms on the blankets where your breath escapes, tiny crystals catching what little light the banked fire provides. The night is full of sounds. The cabin creaks and pops, wood contracting in the cold. Wind moans around the corners, finds its way through gaps with a thin, whistling sound. Snow slides from the roof sometimes with a soft thump. And beneath everything, a deep silence. The profound quiet of a winter night, far from any town, any road, any other human light. You wake sometimes in the deepest cold, around 3 or 4 in the morning when temperatures reach their lowest point. The fire has burned down despite your banking, and the cold has grown aggressive, pressing in from all sides. You must decide, get up now to add wood or try to endure until morning. Sometimes you rise, moving quickly in the dark, placing a log on the coals and returning to bed before you lose too much warmth. Other times, when the cold is truly extreme, you take turns staying awake. Someone must keep watch, must tend the fire, must ensure that the temperature inside doesn't drop so far that danger arrives. You sit, wrapped in blankets, feeding small pieces of wood to the flames, fighting sleep, counting the hours until your turn ends and someone else can take over. There is a strange intimacy in these vigils. Sitting alone while others sleep, you become intensely aware of your place in the world. This tiny pocket of warmth and life, surrounded by thousands of miles of frozen wilderness. You think about those who came before, those who will come after. You think about whether you made the right choice coming here. You think about spring, though spring feels impossibly distant, a half-remembered dream. Morning always comes eventually, though in the deepest winter it feels less like arrival than like the darkness simply becoming slightly less absolute. You stir from sleep, if you slept, and begin the entire cycle again. Water, fire, wood, food, survival. Days blur together in a rhythm so repetitive it becomes almost meditative. Monday and Thursday and Saturday lose their distinctness. There is only today, and today is like yesterday, and tomorrow will be like today. Time becomes measured not in dates, but in observations. The woodpile is lower, the food stores are diminished, the light is returning slightly earlier each day, though that return is maddeningly slow. You develop a relationship with the cold that is hard to explain to someone who has never experienced such a winter. It's not hatred exactly, though there are moments of deep resentment. It's more a kind of wary respect, an acknowledgement of power. The cold is simply there, immense and patient, and you must work within its terms or perish. Small victories become sources of profound satisfaction. A day when the fire lights easily, an afternoon when the sun breaks through clouds and, for an hour, pours weak but real warmth onto your face. A night when everyone sleeps through without waking cold. A week when no one falls ill. Because illness in winter is terrifying. A simple cold becomes a source of dread because there is no doctor, no medicine beyond what you can brew from pine needles or dried herbs, no way to call for help. You watch a fever develop with growing anxiety, sponging the sick person with precious water, keeping them near the fire, praying it passes. Frostbite is another constant threat. You check fingers and toes regularly, looking for the telltale white patches that signal freezing tissue. Chilblains develop, painful, itchy swellings caused by repeated exposure to cold. Your hands crack and bleed, despite tallow rubbed into the skin. Lips split and refuse to heal. The psychological toll is perhaps harder than the physical. The isolation presses on you. You haven't seen another person beyond your immediate family for weeks, maybe months. You haven't heard news from beyond your small world. Letters, if they come at all, arrive months late, bringing information about a world that feels increasingly unreal. You forget the taste of things, fresh bread, ripe fruit, coffee, tea, sugar used freely rather than hoarded. You forget the feel of things, soft fabric, a warm bath, clean clothes that don't smell of smoke. You forget sounds, conversation with strangers, music, the bustle of a town. What you don't forget is determination. Because underneath the hardship and the monotony and the cold runs a stubborn insistence that you will make it through. This land is harsh, yes, but it is yours. This life is difficult, yes, but it is the life you chose or the life that chose you. And there is a fierce kind of pride in enduring. You think about spring obsessively. In your mind, you plan the garden you'll plant when the ground finally thaws. You imagine the first greens, wild onions perhaps, or early dandelion leaves, anything fresh and alive. You dream of the day when the ice on the lake finally breaks up with a sound like thunder, when the geese return, when warmth becomes something more than a memory. But spring is still months away. Right now it's January or February or March, the coldest months, the longest months, when winter feels eternal and unchanging. Right now there is only the next task, the next day, the next night to survive. You check the woodpile again. Still enough for now, but you'll need to cut more soon. You check the food stores, counting and recounting the remaining supplies, trying to calculate if they'll last. You check on everyone in the cabin, making sure no one is developing signs of illness or injury. Outside, the wind picks up, driving snow against the cabin walls with a soft, persistent hiss. The light is fading already, though it's only mid-afternoon. Another night approaches, another long stretch of cold and darkness. You add wood to the fire, watching sparks spiral up toward the chimney. The flames dance and shift, and for a moment you let yourself simply watch them, finding a kind of peace in their movement. This is your life now, fire and wood and water and cold, repeated endlessly, day after day, week after week, month after month. Tomorrow you'll wake cold, you'll restart the fire with numb fingers, you'll fetch water from the frozen creek, you'll chop wood until your hands blister, you'll eat simple food and do simple tasks and count the days until spring. But tonight, right now, the fire is burning well. Tonight you are warm enough. Tonight you are still here, still surviving, still enduring through the long, dark winter of the northern frontier. Her name was Suzanne, though everyone called her Susette, and she was born in the autumn of 1822 in Lower Canada, in a small settlement along the St. Lawrence, where the river runs wide and grey. Her father worked in the fur trade, not as a trapper, but as a middleman, someone who spoke enough French and English and Ojibwe to broker deals between different worlds. This meant that Susette grew up understanding borders were more fluid than most people imagined. She learned early that survival often depended on knowing which language to speak, which customs to honor, which knowledge to respect regardless of its source. Her mother taught her practical things, how to preserve food, how to mend, how to spin wool into thread and thread into cloth. But her father taught her something else, how to listen to the land, how to read weather in the color of the sky, how to understand that the wilderness was not empty, but full if you knew how to see it. She married at 19. His name was Jean-Baptiste, a trapper who had decided to try his hand at settling, at claiming land, at building something permanent. They met at a trading post, and what passed between them was less romance than recognition. Two people who understood what frontier life required, who saw in each other the capacity for endurance. They married in spring and travelled west by summer, moving beyond the established settlements toward land that had barely been surveyed, land that existed mostly as lines on maps drawn by men who had never walked it. They followed rivers, portaged through forests, slept under canvas, and finally arrived at a spot where the land met their requirements, near water with good timber, far enough from the deep wilderness that they might survive, close enough that they could be left alone. That first year was teaching. Susette learned the difference between imagining wilderness and living in it. She learned that isolation wasn't freedom, but a weight that pressed on you constantly. She learned that her hands, which she had always considered capable, would need to become harder, stronger, more resilient than she'd known was possible. Jean-Baptiste built the cabin while Susette cleared land for a garden, pulling stones from the soil until her back ached in ways that never fully eased. They worked through summer and into autumn, racing against the approaching cold, and when winter arrived, they were ready, barely ready, but ready enough. That first winter taught her fear. Not the quick fear of a sudden threat, but the slow fear of watching supplies dwindle, of wondering if they had calculated correctly, of lying awake counting how many weeks of food remained and how many weeks until spring. Jean-Baptiste tried to trap, but his lines were far flung and the snow was deep, and sometimes he was gone for weeks, leaving Susette alone with her thoughts and the endless cold. She discovered during those solitary weeks that she was stronger than she'd known. When the fire burned low and panic rose in her chest, she didn't surrender to it. She simply rebuilt the fire. When her hands split from cold and work, she wrapped them in cloth and kept working. When loneliness threatened to overwhelm her, she spoke aloud to herself, narrating her tasks, filling the silence with her own voice rather than letting it fill with fear. Spring came eventually, though not as early as she'd hoped. By the time the snow finally melted, Susette had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, and Jean-Baptiste had lost 2 toes to frostbite. But they had survived, and survival carried its own grim satisfaction. The second year was easier, though easier is relative. They knew more now, how much wood to cut, how much food to store, how to pace themselves through the endless winter. Susette began keeping a diary, not every day, but when time and energy allowed, writing in a careful hand by firelight. These entries were practical at first, weather observations, notes on food stores, records of what worked and what didn't. But gradually, the diary became something else, a place where she could acknowledge feelings she wouldn't speak aloud, the loneliness, the bone-deep weariness, the moments of despair when she questioned every choice that had brought her here, but also the small beauties, a perfect sunrise, the sound of wolves singing in the distance, the way frost transformed trees into something almost magical. By the third year, they had neighbors. Another family had settled about 4 hours' walk away, close enough to help in emergencies, far enough that visiting required planning. The woman's name was Catherine, and she was Métis, the daughter of a French trader and an Ojibwe mother. She spoke French with an accent that reminded Susette of open spaces, and she knew things about winter survival that Susette desperately needed to learn. Catherine showed her how to smoke dry meat properly, not the quick smoking that looked right, but left the meat vulnerable to spoilage, but the slow, patient process that truly preserved it. She showed her how to make pemmican, dried meat, pounded with fat and berries, dense and nutritious and capable of lasting indefinitely. She taught her which plants could prevent scurvy, that disease of deficiency that loosened teeth and sapped strength. Most valuable of all, Catherine taught her the art of making rabbit skin blankets. Rabbits were plentiful, and their pelts, when treated right, created warmth beyond their size. You had to skin them carefully in long strips, then twist and dry those strips until they formed soft, fluffy ropes of fur. These ropes could be woven together into blankets lighter and warmer than wool, a revelation that changed Susette's winters. In return, Susette shared what she knew, the reading and writing that Catherine wanted her children to learn, the French hymns that Catherine loved to hear, the skills of European cooking that could transform the same ingredients into different meals. They traded knowledge like currency, both understanding that survival here depended on gathering wisdom from every possible source. By the time Susette was 25, she had 2 children, Marie, born in autumn, and Thomas, born in spring. Pregnancy and childbirth in the wilderness carried terrors she tried not to dwell on. There was no doctor, no midwife except Catherine, who rode through winter snow to attend Marie's birth, arriving half-frozen but steady-handed. The children changed everything. Now, Susette's fears had faces, small faces that depended entirely on her competence. She became ferociously protective of their food stores, their firewood, their health. When Jean-Baptiste suggested taking a risk, trapping farther away for better returns, she argued against it with an intensity that surprised them both. The children rarely saw other children. Marie was 4 before she met another child her age, and the encounter left her shy and uncertain, overwhelmed by this strange, small person who spoke and played differently than she did. Thomas barely spoke until he was 3, and even then his words were sparse, economical, as if he'd learned from the silence around him that words should be used carefully. Susette worried about this, wondered if she was raising children who would be too strange for the wider world, too shaped by isolation. But there was no remedy except the one she couldn't have: community, neighbors, normal childhood. So she did what she could, told them stories, taught them letters and numbers scratched in the dirt floor, sang songs she remembered from her own childhood. The winters accumulated, each one its own trial. Some were mild, relatively speaking, and those felt like gifts. Others were brutal, temperatures plunging so low that the trees exploded with sharp cracks in the middle of the night, sap freezing and expanding until the wood shattered. During those winters, Susette felt herself becoming harder, less given to softness, as if she too were freezing into a more rigid form. She learned to ration not just food, but hope. Early winter, she allowed herself to think about spring, but by January, she trained herself to focus only on today, this meal, this task, this moment. Looking too far ahead was dangerous. It revealed the vast stretch of cold still remaining and invited despair. In her diary, she wrote, February the 12th, very cold, wind from north. Thomas has a cough that worries me, but he is eating well. Rabbit stew again. I can no longer remember what an apple tastes like. Simple observations, but beneath them ran currents of feeling too large to name. Jean-Baptiste was gone more often as the years passed, driven by the need to trap enough to trade for the supplies they couldn't produce themselves. Susette understood this necessity but resented it anyway. His absences meant she managed everything: the children, the cabin, the fires, the food, the emergencies. When a shutter broke in a storm, she fixed it. When a wolf came sniffing around the cabin, she fired the musket into the air to scare it away. She became, in effect, both parents, both man and woman, in the traditional division of labor. She did women's work and men's work, inside work and outside work, without the luxury of choosing or refusing, and through this she discovered a kind of competence that went beyond skill, a deep well of capability that she could draw on when circumstances demanded. The worst winter came when Marie was 7 and Thomas was 5. It started early, snow falling in September, and it stayed late, frost still blackening the ground in early May. But worse than its length was a blizzard that arrived in March, just when everyone thought the worst was past. It began innocently enough, a grey morning, wind picking up, temperature dropping. Susette had seen many storms begin this way. But this one didn't stop. The wind grew and grew, driving snow sideways, piling it into drifts that buried the cabin's windows. The world became white chaos, and the howl of the wind was so loud it hurt to hear. Jean-Baptiste was away. Of course he was away, gone to check distant trap lines, planning to return in 2 days. 2 days had become 4, and now the storm made it impossible to know when he might make it back, or if he could, or if he was safe somewhere or frozen in the snow. Susette pulled the children close and tried to project calm she didn't feel. She checked the food stores, enough, but only if the storm didn't last too long. She checked the wood, 3 days, maybe 4 if they were careful. She checked the water, 2 buckets, both still liquid, though they would need to be rationed. The storm lasted 11 days, 11 days of howling wind and battering snow, and a cold so profound that frost grew thick on the inside walls of the cabin. 11 days during which Susette couldn't leave the cabin to fetch water or cut wood. 11 days of making the most careful calculations of her life. On the 3rd day, she began rationing wood. Instead of keeping the fire high, she let it burn lower, just warm enough to prevent freezing, but not warm enough for comfort. They wore every piece of clothing they owned, layered until they could barely move. They huddled together under every blanket and hide, creating a small nest of warmth while the rest of the cabin grew progressively colder. On the 5th day, they ran out of water. Susette melted snow in a pot over the fire, but snow melts down to almost nothing, and it took ages to collect enough to drink. The children complained of thirst constantly, and she rationed the water as carefully as she rationed the wood, allowing each of them only small sips at intervals she calculated and recalculated. By the 7th day, she was down to her last few pieces of firewood. The children had stopped complaining and grown quiet, a quietness that frightened her more than their earlier fussing. They seemed to be withdrawing, retreating into themselves, and she recognized the signs of someone giving up. So she told them stories. Even though her throat was dry and her voice cracked, she told them every story she could remember. Fairy tales from her childhood, adventures from the Bible, tales Catherine had told her about the trickster, Nanabojo, stories she made up on the spot when memory ran dry. She talked and talked, filling the cold cabin with words, keeping them awake, keeping them present. On the 8th day, she found a cache she'd forgotten, a small basket wedged behind the woodpile containing dried berries and tallow she'd put aside months before and lost track of. It wasn't much, but it was something, and that evening they had a tiny bit of sweetness mixed with their rationed food, and it felt like a feast. By the 10th day, Susette was burning furniture, a small shelf Jean-Baptiste had made, a stool with a wobbly leg. She felt no guilt about it. Wood was wood, and survival trumped sentiment. On the 11th morning, she woke to silence. The wind had stopped. The storm had finally broken. She pushed open the door, or tried to. Snow had drifted against it, piling so high she had to dig with her hands to create enough space to squeeze through. When she finally emerged into the transformed world, the sun was shining, painfully bright against the white landscape, and the drifts were so high they had buried the cabin nearly to its roof. Jean-Baptiste arrived later that day, having spent the storm sheltering in a hollow log miles away, slowly working his way home through snow that sometimes reached his chest. When he saw them, thin, exhausted, but alive, he wept, and Susette held him while he shook, and for once neither of them tried to be strong. That storm became a dividing line in her memory, before and after. Before she had believed she understood hardship. After she knew differently. After she carried a new knowledge in her bones, that she could endure things she had thought impossible, but also that luck played a role she didn't want to acknowledge. If the storm had lasted 3 more days, they would have died. There was no maybe about it. The wood would have run out completely, the cold would have crept in, and they would have frozen. They had survived not because of her competence, though that mattered, but because the storm had stopped when it did. This realization was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it meant their survival wasn't entirely in her hands. Terrifying because it meant so much was beyond her control. The years that followed were gentler, though gentle was relative. Marie grew tall and capable, learning to set snares and cure hides and read the weather like her mother. Thomas remained quiet, but developed a gift for working with wood, carving tools and implements with a patience beyond his years. Susette herself grew into middle age, feeling both older and younger than her years. Older in her body, which bore the marks of hard use, scarred hands, a back that ached in cold weather, teeth that had begun to loosen despite her best efforts. Younger in the sense that she sometimes felt she was still learning, still discovering what she was capable of. She continued her diary, though the entries grew sparser as time passed. Some years she wrote weekly, other years only a few times. But she never stopped completely, sensing somehow that these records mattered, that someone someday might want to know what this life had been like. In one entry from 1854 she wrote, "The children are both down with winter coughs, the rattling kind that makes me fear for their lungs. Jean-Baptiste brought tea from the trading post, real tea, and we had a celebration, just the 4 of us, drinking tea with a tiny bit of sugar, and it felt like the grandest party." Thomas asked, "If this is what life is like in Montreal?" I told him yes, even though I don't really remember anymore. In another entry, much later, Marie is 17 now and talks of leaving, of going to find work in one of the towns that are springing up. I want to forbid it, but I cannot. She has lived her whole life here, knowing nothing but cabin and forest and cold. How can I deny her the chance to know something else? And yet the thought of her leaving opens a hollow in my chest. By the time Susette reached 40, the frontier had begun to change. More settlers arrived each year, pushing farther into what had been wilderness. A road was cut through, rough but passable, connecting their region to distant towns. The trading post grew into a small settlement, and mail arrived with something resembling regularity. These changes brought both relief and loss. Relief because isolation eased, because help was closer, because supplies were more reliable. Loss because the world she had learned to navigate, harsh but comprehensible, was transforming into something else, something neither wilderness nor civilization, but an uncomfortable mixture of both. Susette found herself in the strange position of being valued for her knowledge. Newer settlers sought her advice about surviving winter, about managing isolation, about the thousand small skills that kept you alive in this climate. She shared what she knew, though she sometimes felt like she was describing a world that was already fading, her expertise becoming less necessary with each passing year. In her 50s, after Jean-Baptiste died, quietly, in his sleep, his heart simply stopping one winter night, Susette chose to stay in the cabin rather than move to the settlement. Marie had married and moved away. Thomas had joined a logging crew. The cabin that had once felt impossibly small now felt vast, echoing with absence. She lived there alone for another decade, growing vegetables in summer, preserving food in autumn, enduring winter in the old familiar way. Neighbors checked on her, sometimes bringing supplies, sometimes just visiting to hear her stories. She had become, without quite meaning to, a kind of living history, someone who remembered how things used to be. Her final diary entry, written in February of 1867, reads, "Cold today. My hands shake when I write now, hard to make the letters. I have been thinking about all the winters. How many? 45 years of winters, 46? I have lost count. Each one I thought I wouldn't survive, and each one I did. There is something to be said for stubbornness. The young woman who came here thought she was brave. She was really just stubborn. But stubborn is enough. Stubborn has always been enough." She died that spring, just as the ice was breaking up on the lake, found by a neighbor who had come to bring her fresh bread. She was sitting in her chair by the window, looking out at the thawing world, and on her face was an expression that the neighbor later described as peaceful, though it might equally have been simply tired. The deep tiredness of someone who had carried a heavy load for a very long time and was finally allowed to set it down. Her diary survived her, passed down through Thomas's family, and eventually donated to a historical society where it sat in archives for decades before being rediscovered. When scholars finally read it carefully, they found in its pages not grand adventures or dramatic moments, but something perhaps more valuable, a record of persistence, of how one person endured through repetition and stubbornness and an unwillingness to surrender even when surrender seemed reasonable. Susette never saw herself as remarkable. In her own estimation, she had simply done what needed doing, day after day, winter after winter. But it's precisely this quality, the unadorned persistence, the quiet refusal to quit, that makes her story worth remembering. She represents not the heroes of frontier mythology, the bold explorers and legendary trappers, but the other kind of heroism, showing up every day in the cold and the dark and keeping the fire alive. Deep in the northern forests, beneath layers of soil and pine needles and centuries of accumulated leaf fall, lie structures that archaeologists still debate. They appear as circular depressions in the ground, perhaps 3 feet across, perhaps 5, varying in size and depth. When excavated carefully, they reveal themselves as deliberate constructions, pits lined with stones or bark, filled with earth and charcoal, and sometimes the bones of animals arranged in patterns no one has yet definitively explained. The circular forms hold their shape even after centuries, testimony to the care taken in their original construction. These are winter cache pits, and they represent one of the quieter mysteries of northern life, a practical technology layered with meanings we may never fully recover. They were dug by indigenous peoples across the subarctic regions for centuries before European contact, and later adopted, adapted, or reinvented by settlers who learned their utility through observation or desperate necessity. The basic function seems clear enough. In a landscape where winter brought temperatures low enough to preserve food, but also brought predators hungry enough to dig for it, a cache pit offered secure storage. Meat could be cached there, away from the cabin, away from the smell that drew wolves and wolverines. Supplies could be hidden against theft or disaster. Emergency stores could be placed along trap lines or travel routes, ready for someone who might need them desperately. The logic was simple: distribute your resources, never keep everything in one place, create small deposits of security scattered across the landscape. But when you look closely at the archaeological record, simplicity dissolves into complexity. Some cache pits are found in locations that make practical sense, near winter camps, along known travel routes, in places where hunters regularly passed. Others appear in locations that seem arbitrary, far from any settlement or obvious path, as if deliberately hidden not just from animals but from human discovery. These outlying pits pose questions that practical explanations struggle to answer. The contents, when they survive, add to the puzzle. Some pits contain exactly what you'd expect: bones from deer or caribou, often butchered in specific ways that suggest careful preservation. But others contain bones arranged in patterns, circles or lines or careful stacks that don't correspond to any obvious storage method. The arrangement speaks of intention, of meaning beyond mere storage. One pit, excavated in northern Ontario in the late 1970s, contained the skull of a bear positioned at the center, surrounded by a ring of small stones, surrounded in turn by a layer of charcoal, surrounded by larger stones. No other bear bones were present. No meat could have been stored there. The charcoal would have contaminated it. So, what was this pit for? Dr. Margaret Fielding, the archaeologist who studied it, proposed that some cache pits served dual purposes: practical storage and spiritual practice. The bear skull pit might have been an offering, a way of honoring the animal's spirit while also marking territory or a significant location. In many northern indigenous cultures, bears held special significance, and their remains were treated with ceremonies that acknowledged both the animal's power and the hunter's debt. The bear was seen as a relative, a being deserving of respect and proper treatment even in death. Other researchers disagreed. Dr. Thomas Brightwood argued that the patterns could be entirely practical, representing preservation techniques we no longer understand. Perhaps the charcoal served as insulation, or as a way to mark the pit for later retrieval, or as protection against some specific type of decay or contamination. His skepticism reflected a broader divide in archaeology between those who saw symbolic meaning everywhere and those who insisted on practical explanations. The debate continued for years, friendly but unresolved, because the cache pits themselves offered no clear answers. They sat silent in the ground, holding their secrets in earth and stone. What makes these structures particularly intriguing is their distribution. They appear across thousands of miles of northern territory, from the Great Lakes to the Yukon, suggesting either a shared technology that spread through trade and contact, or a solution so obvious that different peoples arrived at it independently. Both possibilities speak to the ingenuity required for winter survival in these regions. The cache pit represents not a single invention, but a category of invention, adapted to local conditions and materials. In some areas, cache pits were lined with birch bark, which has natural preservative properties and remains flexible even when frozen. In others, they were lined with flat stones carefully selected and fitted together like puzzle pieces. Some were sealed with layers of moss, which provided insulation and absorbed excess moisture. Others used animal hides, stretched taut and weighted with stones. The variety of construction methods suggests deep knowledge of local materials and their properties. A person creating a cache pit needed to understand not just general principles, but specific applications: which bark peeled most cleanly, which stones would crack in frost, which soils drained properly. This knowledge couldn't be learned from books or taught in formal lessons. It came from observation, from trial and error, from stories passed down through generations about pits that had succeeded and those that had failed. Imagine the knowledge required to create an effective cache pit. You needed to understand soil composition. Too sandy and it would collapse, too clayey and water would pool and freeze. You needed to understand depth, deep enough to protect from predators and prevent thawing during temperature fluctuations, but not so deep that you couldn't access it when the ground was frozen solid. The sweet spot varied by location, by soil type, by average winter temperatures. You needed to understand location. Place a cache pit in a low area and spring melt might flood it. Place it on a hilltop and wind might expose it. You needed landmarks to find it again after snow had buried the landscape and transformed familiar terrain into an undifferentiated white expanse. The psychology of landmark selection reveals sophisticated spatial thinking. Good landmarks were features that wouldn't change: large rocks, distinctive trees with unusual growth patterns, the intersection of two ridgelines. Poor landmarks were things that might disappear, fallen logs that would rot, young trees that might be blown down, streams that might change course. The cache pit builder had to think not just in space but in time, imagining the landscape months or years hence. And you needed to understand time. A cache pit was an investment in the future, a bet that you would return, that you would need what you'd stored, that the pit would remain undisturbed until that moment of need arrived. In a life lived close to the edge of survival, this required a kind of faith in your own memory, faith in the land's consistency, faith that disaster wouldn't intervene between storage and retrieval. Every cache pit represented an act of hope. The frontier settlers who learned about cache pits from indigenous neighbors or discovered their utility independently added their own variations. Some pits show evidence of European construction techniques: squared corners, wooden lining, iron nails. But most adopted the indigenous methods wholesale, recognizing that centuries of experience had refined these techniques beyond improvement. Pride gave way to pragmatism when winter threatened. The archaeological evidence of this cultural exchange is subtle but present. One cache pit in northern Minnesota contained both traditional stone lining and iron nails, suggesting a hybrid construction. Another in Manitoba showed birch bark, lining secured with manufactured rope rather than traditional cordage. These material signatures tell stories of adaptation, of old knowledge meeting new materials. Catherine, the Métis woman who taught Susette about winter survival, would have known about cache pits intimately. Her Ojibwe mother's people had used them for generations, and Catherine carried that knowledge into her married life. When she showed Susette how to smoke meat, she might also have mentioned caching, how to choose a site, how to dig the pit, how to line it properly. These conversations would have happened casually, woven into the daily work of preparation and preservation. Whether Susette used cache pits, her diary doesn't say, but other settler accounts mention them frequently, especially in accounts from trappers and hunters who ranged far from their cabins. A cache pit along a trap line could mean the difference between making it home and freezing in the wilderness. It was a small piece of security in a profoundly insecure existence. One trapper's journal from 1847 describes a network of cache pits along his winter route, each one carefully mapped in a personal code he feared others might decipher. His anxiety about theft speaks to the value these hidden stores represented. The journal also describes his ritual of visiting each cache in early autumn to verify its location and condition before the first snow. This seasonal maintenance was part of the larger rhythm of preparation that governed northern life. What fascinates archaeologists most are the pits that seem to serve no obvious practical purpose. These are found most often in remote locations, sometimes at the bases of unusual rock formations or near springs that remain open even in winter. Some contain offerings, tobacco, beads, metal objects that would have held value. Some contain combinations of materials that make no practical sense, but might make symbolic sense: feathers and stones, shells far from any ocean, pieces of worked copper. Dr. Sarah Littlebird, an Anishinaabe archaeologist, has suggested that these represent a conversation between practical and spiritual needs. Winter, she wrote, was not just a physical challenge but a spiritual one. The cold, the darkness, the isolation, these tested people in ways that required more than physical preparation. The cache pits might have been a way of anchoring yourself in the landscape, of creating relationship with specific places, of marking your presence and your respect. This interpretation finds support in oral histories. Many northern indigenous cultures have stories about giving gifts to the land, about creating relationships with specific locations through offerings and ceremonies. A cache pit could serve as a tangible expression of this relationship, part storage, part offering, part prayer. The act of digging itself might have been ceremonial, a way of entering into conversation with the earth. Consider what it would have been like to dig a cache pit in autumn, knowing winter was coming. The ground is already starting to freeze, so you must work quickly. You choose your location carefully, memorizing landmarks: this tree shaped like a hand, that rock with the vein of quartz, the angle of the hillside. You dig down through layers of soil, each layer telling a story of previous seasons. This year's leaf fall, last year's decomposition, deeper layers where time becomes less distinct. The physical work of digging warms you even as the autumn air cools. Your hands grip the digging stick or shovel, finding a rhythm that can be sustained. Down you go, through roots that must be cut or worked around, through stones that must be pried loose and set aside. The pit takes shape gradually, each basket of earth removed revealing more of the whole that will become your winter security. When the pit is complete, you line it with bark or stones or both. You place your cache inside, meat wrapped in hide perhaps, or tools you'll need later, or trade goods. You cover it carefully, returning the soil, arranging the surface to look undisturbed, or marking it in a way only you will recognize. The final touches matter: scatter leaves, arrange a few sticks, make it look like nothing human happened here. And then you walk away carrying with you the knowledge of this small, secret place. Through winter, in the darkest and coldest nights, you can think about it. This store of food or supplies or value, waiting frozen in the ground, a small piece of security against catastrophe. The psychological comfort this provided should not be underestimated. Knowing that resources existed, cached and waiting, allowed people to take risks they might otherwise avoid. A hunter might range farther from camp, knowing that emergency supplies waited along the route. A trapper might extend the trapline, knowing that cached food meant survival if storms delayed the return home. The mystery deepens when you consider cache pits that appear to have been deliberately destroyed. These show evidence of being opened and then filled with stones, or burned, or covered with layers of charcoal that make them useless for future storage. Why would someone go to the trouble of destroying a cache pit? The energy expenditure alone argues against casual destruction. One theory suggests theft. Someone found another's cache and destroyed it to prevent its recovery. But this seems unlikely in most cases because many destroyed pits are in locations so remote that random discovery seems improbable. The effort required to reach some of these sites argues against opportunistic theft. Why travel so far to destroy what you've already stolen? Another theory suggests spiritual practice. Perhaps certain cache pits were meant to be temporary, used once and then closed in a ceremony that marked the end of a particular season or journey. Perhaps the destruction was itself an offering, a way of returning something to the earth. In some indigenous traditions, objects were ritually broken or burned to release their spirit or to complete a cycle of use. Or perhaps the answer is simpler and sadder. Perhaps some cache pits were destroyed by people who knew they wouldn't return, who were leaving the territory permanently, or who sensed their own death approaching. Destroying the cache might have been a way of preventing others from claiming it, or a way of completing a cycle, of cleaning up after yourself, even when you knew no one would ever check. There's something poignant about imagining someone taking the time to properly close a cache pit one final time. The archaeological record preserves these actions but not the intentions behind them. We can measure the diameter of a pit, analyze the composition of its fill, identify the species of bones it contains, but we cannot know what the person who dug it was thinking, what they hoped or feared, what meanings they invested in this simple hole in the ground. The physical evidence tells us what happened, but remains stubbornly silent about why. This uncertainty is perhaps fitting. The cache pit represents a fundamentally private act, storing something away, hiding it from view, creating a secret between yourself and the land. That some of these secrets remain secrets even after centuries seems appropriate. We are, in a sense, looking at someone's private preparations, their personal security measures, their intimate relationship with landscape. Modern archaeology has found hundreds of cache pits across the northern regions, but researchers believe this represents only a fraction of what once existed. Many would have been destroyed by natural processes, erosion, tree growth, the slow working of frost and thaw. Others remain undiscovered, marked by depressions so subtle they escape notice, or buried under development, or simply missed. Every year, construction projects or natural erosion reveals new cache pits, adding to the catalogue of mystery. Each discovered cache pit offers a small window into winter survival strategies, but that window is often clouded by time. We see the what, but struggle with the why. We can reconstruct the technique, but not fully recover the meaning. This gap between physical evidence and human intention defines much of archaeology, but cache pits make it particularly acute because they were designed to be private, to be hidden, to keep their secrets. There's something quietly profound about this. These pits represent human ingenuity, practical knowledge refined over generations, solutions to real problems of survival. But they also represent something less tangible, the human need to mark presence, to create relationship with landscape, to invest physical places with personal and spiritual meaning. A cache pit is simultaneously utterly practical and deeply symbolic. The technical sophistication required for successful caching extended beyond the pit itself to the methods of food preparation and storage. Meat intended for long-term caching had to be processed differently than meat for immediate consumption. It needed to be partially dried, often smoked, sometimes treated with substances that would inhibit decay. The preparation methods varied by climate, by season, by the type of meat being preserved. Caribou meat was often cut into thin strips and partially dried before caching, reducing weight and volume while increasing preservation. Bear meat required more careful handling due to its fat content, which could turn rancid even in cold storage. Fish had to be cleaned and dried thoroughly, then wrapped in bark to prevent freezer burn from contact with frozen soil. Each species, each cut, each storage duration demanded specific knowledge. The wrapping materials mattered too. Animal hides provided protection, but also held moisture that could freeze and cause damage. Bark kept meat dry, but might impart flavors or allow insect access, if not perfectly sealed. Some cache pits show evidence of multiple layers of wrapping, hide, then bark, then hide again, suggesting a sophisticated understanding of how different materials work together. Archaeological analysis of cache pit contents sometimes reveals surprising details about seasonal movements and hunting patterns. One pit in the Northwest Territories contained bones from fish species that spawn in autumn, caribou taken during the fall migration, and small game typical of early winter. This sequence tells a story, someone following the seasonal rounds, harvesting different resources as they became available, caching surplus against future need. The pit becomes a calendar, recording the rhythm of a year. Other pits reveal longer timescales. Some contain layers of material clearly deposited in different years, suggesting that successful cache pits were reused across seasons. These multi-layer pits show refinement of technique, each layer carefully sealed before the next was added, maintaining the pit's integrity across multiple uses. The investment in a good cache pit location paid dividends over years. The relationship between cache pits and territorial knowledge deserves consideration. Creating a network of cache pits required intimate familiarity with a large territory, knowledge of soil types, drainage patterns, predator ranges, travel routes. This knowledge represented a kind of wealth, a mapping of the land in terms of survival resources. To know where cache pits were located was to hold power in a landscape where knowledge often meant the difference between life and death. Some researchers suggest that cache pit locations might have been inherited, passed down through families or groups along with other territorial rights. The ethnographic record includes mentions of family hunting grounds that included not just the right to hunt, but knowledge of specific locations, springs, crossings, and yes, cache sites. A cache pit dug by a grandfather might be maintained by his grandchildren, the knowledge of its location a form of inheritance more valuable than physical goods. The pit became a thread connecting generations. The social dynamics of cache pits also interest contemporary researchers. In cultures that valued sharing and reciprocity, how were cache pits negotiated? Could one person use another's cache in emergency? Were there rules about cache pit etiquette, unspoken agreements about access and use? The archaeological record offers few answers, but oral histories suggest complex social arrangements. Some traditions speak of community caches maintained collectively and available to anyone in need. Others describe personal caches that were nevertheless obligated to be shared under certain circumstances. The tension between individual security and collective survival played out in these underground stores. Consider the ethical dimensions of finding someone else's cache. In a landscape where caching was common, the possibility of accidentally discovering another's store must have been real. What obligations did such discovery create? The evidence suggests different responses. Some cache pits show signs of being carefully recovered after opening, as if someone had looked inside and then respected the cache by sealing it again. When you stand in a northern forest today, especially in winter, you might be standing near a cache pit and never know it. Beneath the snow, beneath the soil, beneath the roots of trees that have grown and died and grown again, these structures wait, holding their mysteries with the same patience they once held cached meat or tools or offerings. Imagine walking through such a forest at night. The moon is bright enough to cast shadows through the bare branches. Snow covers everything, muffling sound, transforming familiar landmarks into strange, ghostly versions of themselves. You know that beneath this blanket of white lie stories, cache pits dug by hands long since turned to dust, filled with objects whose meanings have faded, marking moments of hope or desperation or simple practical preparation. You walk carefully, aware that each step might pass over hidden history. The cold presses close and you pull your coat tighter, and for a moment you feel a kinship with those earlier people who walked this same land, who felt this same cold, who looked at winter not as a season to endure but as a problem to solve through knowledge and preparation and the small securities of hidden stores. The temperature drops as night deepens and your breath becomes visible, and you think about the people who walked here without modern gear, without weather forecasts, without the option of retreat to heated buildings. They walked with knowledge instead. Knowledge of where they had cached supplies, knowledge of which direction to travel, knowledge accumulated over lifetimes and shared across generations. The cache pit mystery remains unsolved, and perhaps that's how it should be. Some knowledge is meant to stay buried, some meanings are meant to remain private, between the person who created them and the land that received them. But the pits themselves endure, testimony to human adaptability and the endless creative responses to winter's challenges. They remind us that survival in such places required not just physical hardship, but intellectual sophistication, understanding of geology, biology, weather patterns, animal behavior, and perhaps most importantly, the deep time of seasons, the patience to prepare today for needs that might arise months hence. Modern people sometimes romanticize northern survival, imagining it as a simpler life free from contemporary complications. But cache pits tell a different story, one of constant calculation and preparation, of sophisticated planning and technical knowledge, of balancing immediate needs against future security. Life in the northern forests was never simple. It was complex and demanding, and required constant attention to detail. The cache pit stands as physical evidence of this complexity. Each one represents dozens of decisions: when to dig, where to dig, how deep, what to cache, how to mark the location, when to return. Each decision drew on accumulated knowledge and required judgment about uncertain futures. Getting it right meant survival. Getting it wrong could mean disaster. Archaeological excavation techniques for cache pits have evolved over decades. Early excavations often treated them like any other archaeological feature, removing content systematically but without special attention to the unique preservation conditions. Modern excavations are more careful, recognizing that frozen or semi-frozen cache pits might preserve organic materials that would otherwise decay. Archaeologists now use specialized tools to detect cache pits before digging: ground-penetrating radar, soil resistivity surveys, careful examination of vegetation patterns that might indicate subsurface disturbance. The discovery process itself can be dramatic. One archaeologist described finding a cache pit during a survey in northern Manitoba. She noticed a slight depression in the ground, barely visible, that didn't quite match the surrounding terrain. After careful excavation, they found a pit lined with birch bark, still intact after perhaps 200 years, containing the bones of what appeared to be a single caribou, carefully butchered and arranged. The preservation was extraordinary. Even some of the hide wrappings survived, allowing detailed analysis of processing techniques. Such well-preserved sites are rare and precious, offering insights impossible to gain from more degraded examples. They show us not just what was cached, but how it was prepared, how it was wrapped, how carefully it was placed. One site in the Yukon revealed cloth wrapping around cached meat, the fabric analysis showing it was European-manufactured cotton, suggesting a date after contact, but still using traditional caching methods. The blend of old and new technologies in a single cache pit illustrates the complex ways cultures adapt and adopt. The seasonal timing of cache pit creation reveals another layer of sophistication. Archaeological evidence suggests most pits were dug in autumn, after the first hard frost but before the ground froze solid. This narrow window required careful attention to weather and seasonal signals. Dig too early and the cache might spoil before winter's preserving cold arrived. Dig too late and the ground would be too hard to work. But some pits show evidence of winter construction, dug through frozen ground with immense effort. These unusual sites raise questions about emergency situations or special circumstances that made such labor worthwhile. What would drive someone to dig through frozen earth when normal timing would have been so much easier? The answers probably involve necessity, an unexpected surplus of meat, a change in plans, an opportunity that couldn't wait for spring thaw. The tools used for digging cache pits evolved with technology and availability. Indigenous peoples used digging sticks of hardwood, sometimes fire-hardened for extra durability, along with flat stones for scraping and bone scoops for removing loose soil. Settlers added metal tools, spades and shovels, which made the work faster but didn't fundamentally change the technique. Some hybrid tools appear in the archaeological record: wooden handles with metal blades, combining traditional forms with new materials. The size of cache pits varied with purpose and contents. Small pits, perhaps 2 feet across and 3 feet deep, might hold emergency supplies for a single person, a few days' worth of food, fire-making materials, extra clothing. Larger pits, 5 feet across or more, could store enough meat to feed a family through a harsh stretch of winter. The largest cache pits found by archaeologists suggest communal efforts, resources pooled and stored collectively. One remarkable site in northern Ontario contained a complex of 7 cache pits arranged in a rough circle, all approximately the same size and showing evidence of simultaneous construction. The arrangement suggests coordinated effort by a group, perhaps a hunting party caching their collective take before dispersing for winter. The coordination required for such an effort speaks to social organization and planning, deciding how to divide the cached goods, establishing agreements about access, marking locations so all parties could retrieve their shares. This wasn't just practical work but social work, negotiating relationships through the physical act of caching. Temperature management in cache pits required understanding of thermal dynamics. Too shallow and temperature fluctuations during warm spells might cause partial thawing and refreezing, damaging the cached goods. Too deep in certain soils and the pit might encounter warmer earth, defeating the preservation purpose. The ideal depth varied with latitude, soil type, and local climate patterns. Knowledge that had to be learned through experience and shared through teaching. Some cache pits show evidence of insulation strategies, layers of moss, pine needles, or bark that created air gaps and reduced temperature transfer. These details reveal sophisticated understanding of how materials affect temperature, how different layers work together to maintain stable cold. A well-designed cache pit remained consistently frozen even during brief warm spells, protecting its contents throughout winter and into spring. The engineering was simple but effective, refined through countless iterations across centuries. The relationship between cache pits and travel routes reveals patterns of movement across the landscape. Archaeologists have mapped cache pit locations and found clusters along natural corridors, river valleys, ridge tops, passes through higher terrain. These weren't random distributions but deliberate placements along paths people regularly traveled. A traveler could move through the territory with confidence, knowing that cached supplies waited at strategic intervals. The spacing of cache pits along these routes varied with terrain and purpose. In easily traveled terrain, cache pits might be spaced farther apart, placed a full day's travel from each other. In difficult terrain, mountains, dense forest, areas prone to dangerous weather, cache pits were placed more closely, providing more frequent opportunities for resupply or shelter. The pattern reveals a deep understanding of the territory's challenges and dangers. Modern hikers sometimes stumble upon these ancient cache pits without recognizing them. A slight depression in the forest floor, a ring of stones barely visible through moss and leaf litter. These subtle signs might mark a cache pit centuries old. Most go unnoticed, and that's perhaps for the best. Archaeological sites are fragile and unmarked cache pits are protected by their obscurity. But occasionally someone recognizes what they're seeing, a depression too regular to be natural, stones arranged with clear intention, a location that makes sense for travel and storage. In those moments, the past becomes briefly visible, and the walker finds themselves sharing space with history. One such discovery led to an important archaeological finding. A hiker in northern Quebec noticed an unusual depression and reported it to authorities, leading to excavation that revealed one of the best preserved cache pits ever found. Inside were not food remains but tools, a complete set of iron traps, still functional after decades or centuries underground, along with a fire steel and several knives. Someone had cached these valuable tools and never returned to retrieve them. The story behind this mystery, why the cache was never emptied, what happened to its creator, remains unknown, but the discovery added valuable data to the archaeological record. The spiritual dimensions of cache pits continue to generate scholarly debate. Dr. Littlebird's interpretations have found support among some researchers and skepticism among others. The skeptics argue that reading spiritual meaning into archaeological features risks projecting modern assumptions onto past peoples. Better, they argue, to stick with what can be proven, that cache pits were practical storage solutions, nothing more. But the counter-argument points to the ethnographic record, to the oral histories, to the persistence of ceremonial practices around food storage in contemporary indigenous communities. These living traditions suggest continuities with past practices, hinting that spiritual meanings might indeed have accompanied practical functions. The truth likely varies by individual, by community, by specific circumstance. Some cache pits were purely practical, others carried symbolic or spiritual weight. Most probably existed somewhere in between, serving multiple purposes simultaneously. Human beings rarely separate practical and spiritual dimensions as completely as modern scholarship sometimes suggests. A cache pit could be at once a food store, a marker of territorial knowledge, a demonstration of skill, a gift to future self, an offering to the land, and a prayer for safe return. The question of how many cache pits existed at the peak of their use, before European contact significantly disrupted indigenous lifeways, remains unanswerable but intriguing. If we assume that most families or hunting groups maintained several cache pits across their territory and multiply this by the population of the northern regions, the number reaches into the tens of thousands. Most have vanished without trace, destroyed by natural processes, or simply forgotten as the people who made them died or were displaced. We're left with fragments of a much larger system, archaeological snapshots of what was once an extensive network of stored security. Climate change adds new urgency to cache pit archaeology. As permafrost thaws in far northern regions, previously frozen cache pits are degrading rapidly, their contents exposed to decay that frozen conditions had prevented for centuries. Archaeologists race to document and excavate these sites before they're lost entirely. The work is complicated by logistics. Many sites are in remote locations, accessible only by helicopter or boat, and the brief summer window for fieldwork limits what can be accomplished each year. Yet despite these challenges, new discoveries continue. Each excavation adds to our understanding, each cache pit tells part of the larger story. The picture that emerges is of northern peoples who were sophisticated engineers of survival, who understood their environment with precision and creativity, who developed technologies perfectly adapted to their circumstances. The cache pit stands as elegant testimony to this expertise. Contemporary northern communities sometimes reference cache pits in discussions about traditional knowledge and cultural preservation. For some, the cache pit represents continuity with ancestral practices, a tangible link to ways of life that persist despite dramatic changes. For others, it symbolizes resilience and adaptation, the ability of peoples to develop solutions to extreme environmental challenges. The cache pit becomes a metaphor for survival itself. Some indigenous educators use cache pits as teaching tools, helping young people understand ancestral technologies and the knowledge systems that supported them. Building a cache pit, even a demonstration pit that won't actually be used, requires attention to landscape, materials, and technique. The process of construction teaches observation and planning, connecting participants to both land and tradition. These educational programs recognize that traditional knowledge isn't just about specific practices, but about ways of thinking, of observing, of relating to the environment. The cache pit in this context becomes more than a historical artifact. It becomes a living link to epistemologies, ways of knowing that differ from Western scientific approaches, but are no less sophisticated or valuable. The knowledge required to create effective cache pits represents centuries of accumulated observation, experimentation, and teaching, refined through countless iterations into a technology that served its purposes beautifully. This knowledge deserves recognition not as primitive survival technique, but as genuine scientific achievement. As we walk away from these thoughts, leaving the cache pits in their forest solitude, certain truths settle into place. The northern landscape remains, as it always has been, a place of challenge and beauty. The people who lived there developed ways of meeting those challenges that deserve our respect and careful study. Their solutions weren't simple or crude, but sophisticated and effective, demonstrating intelligence and creativity that matches any technological achievement. The cache pit stands as monument and mystery, a testament to human ingenuity that still guards some of its secrets. Perhaps this is fitting. The land keeps what it's given, patient and silent, waiting for those who take time to look carefully, to think deeply, to recognize in a simple depression in the forest floor the marks of human hands working with landscape, negotiating with winter, creating small securities against an uncertain future. The conversation between people and land continues, and the cache pits remain as evidence of its long history. Not everyone who inhabited the northern wilderness in the 1800s lived as Susette lived, or struggled as the settlers in their drafty cabins struggled. Even on the frontier, privilege existed, creating a geography of comfort that mapped closely to the geography of power. While some families counted their remaining beans by candlelight, others sat down to meals of imported flour, preserved fruits, and meat that they had not personally trapped or butchered. The Hudson's Bay Company, that vast commercial empire that dominated the fur trade across much of northern North America, provides perhaps the clearest example. The company maintained trading posts throughout the wilderness, and at these posts lived company officers, men who occupied positions in a corporate hierarchy that stretched from these remote outposts to boardrooms in London. These officers inhabited a different winter than the settlers around them. Their quarters were not rough log cabins but substantial buildings, often 2 stories, with multiple rooms and proper windows, real glass, not oiled paper or animal membrane. The walls were thick, the doors fitted properly, and stoves or fireplaces provided heat that actually warmed the space rather than merely preventing freezing. Inside these buildings, the trappings of British gentility persisted despite the surrounding wilderness. Officers maintained libraries, modest but real, containing books shipped at great expense across ocean and portage. They dressed for dinner, changing from their working clothes into proper jackets, maintaining the fiction that they lived in civilization rather than at its farthest edge. Their meals reflected this same determination to preserve European standards. Company ships brought supplies from across the Atlantic, tea and sugar, coffee, molasses, flour, that was actually white rather than the coarse brown stuff most settlers managed. Preserved fruits arrived in tins, and on special occasions, Christmas, important visits, there might be delicacies that would astound their neighbors: candied ginger, pickled vegetables, even wine or brandy. The officers didn't cut their own wood. That labor fell to voyageurs, to local indigenous workers hired by the company, to anyone lower in the rigid hierarchy. Nor did they haul their own water or butcher their own meat, or perform the 100 small tasks of daily survival that consumed every waking hour for the Susettes of the world. Instead, their work was administrative, managing accounts, corresponding with distant superiors, overseeing the complex system of credit and trade that moved furs from trap to market. This was real work requiring real skills, but it was work performed in relative comfort, work that ended at a reasonable hour, work that left time for reading and correspondence and the maintenance of a civilized routine. George Simpson, who served as governor of the Hudson's Bay Company territories for decades in the mid-1800s, epitomized this frontier elite. He traveled extensively throughout company lands, and his journals reveal a man intensely aware of his status and deeply committed to maintaining it. When he traveled, he did so with an entourage, guides, paddlers, servants, all organized to ensure his comfort even in transit. Simpson's winter residences, he maintained several across the vast territory, were furnished with a gentility that would have seemed impossible to nearby settlers. Carpets covered the floors, curtains hung at the windows. Furniture was actual furniture, not rough-hewn benches and tables, but chairs and desks shipped piece by piece across impossible distances. He kept detailed records of his meals, and these records read like a reproach to the monotony of settler diets. Breakfast might include fresh bread, butter, eggs, tea with sugar. Dinner featured multiple courses: soup, meat, vegetables, preserved in various ways, dessert. Supper was lighter, but still substantial. Never did he write about stretching rations or wondering if food would last until spring. Yet Simpson was not oblivious to the hardships around him. His journals mentioned settlers he encountered, voyageurs who worked for the company, indigenous families whose lands he traversed. Sometimes he expressed sympathy for their conditions. More often, he treated hardship as simply the natural order of things. Some people were meant to labor and endure, while others were meant to manage and oversee. This attitude pervaded the company hierarchy. Officers saw themselves as bringing civilization to wilderness, maintaining standards in a place that threatened to degrade them. The comfort they enjoyed wasn't excess, but necessity. How else could educated men endure years at remote posts? Their privileges were the tools that allowed them to function, to maintain the mental clarity and moral fiber required for leadership. The missionaries who established stations throughout the Northern Territories operated with similar contradictions. They came to bring Christianity to indigenous populations, to save souls, and they endured real hardships in pursuit of this goal. But their hardships were generally cushioned by support from distant churches, by supply lines that brought them food and clothing and medicine, by networks that ensured they were never truly alone or abandoned. Father Jean-Baptiste Thibault, an oblate missionary who worked throughout what is now Alberta and Saskatchewan in the 1840s and 1850s, traveled extensively among indigenous communities and isolated settler families. His accounts describe genuine suffering, cold nights on the trail, dangerous river crossings, encounters with hunger and disease. But he always had somewhere to return to: a mission station with a stove and a bed, supplies of flour and salt pork, books and writing materials. When Thibault fell ill, which happened periodically, he could rest. When settlers fell ill, they generally kept working because stopping meant their families might freeze or starve. This difference, the ability to rest, to recover, to receive care, marked a fundamental divide between those with institutional support and those without. The mission stations themselves often became small centers of relative comfort in the wilderness. They housed not just missionaries, but also children attending mission schools, sick people seeking care, travelers needing shelter. These institutions performed real services, but they also created hierarchies. The missionaries controlled access to resources, determined who received help and who didn't, and in the process assumed a power that went beyond spiritual leadership into the realm of basic survival. Consider a winter scene at a typical mission station. Inside, a fire burns in a proper stove, warming the main room to tolerable temperatures. The missionary sits at a desk, writing letters by candlelight, his fingers cold but not numb, his body tired but not exhausted. In the next room, children sleep on actual beds under actual blankets, having eaten actual supper. Outside, beyond the mission fence, an indigenous family camps, having traveled for days to reach this place. They hope to receive food, medicine, perhaps baptism for a sick child. Whether they receive these things depends on factors beyond simple need. Are they Christian already or willing to become so? Have they been cooperative in the past? Does the missionary deem them worthy? This is not to say missionaries were universally cruel or uncaring. Many genuinely wanted to help, and many did help, often at personal cost. But the structure itself, institutional resources controlled by individuals who could grant or withhold them, created relationships of dependency and judgment that complicated every interaction. Back in distant cities, winter in the north became the subject of romantic speculation. Eastern newspapers published accounts of frontier life written by travelers who had spent perhaps a single winter in the wilderness, or who wrote based on second-hand stories, or who simply invented details they thought their readers wanted. These accounts emphasized adventure and picturesqueness, transforming hardship into entertainment for parlor reading. Books appeared with titles like Winter Among the Savages or My Life as a Fur Trader's Wife, and they sold briskly to urban audiences hungry for exotic tales. They described snow and cold as backdrop for human drama, not as the grinding, exhausting reality that people like Susette lived. They made heroes of company officers and missionaries, portraying them as civilizers bringing light to darkness, rarely questioning whether that light was wanted or whether the darkness was as dark as claimed. In Montreal, in Toronto, in Boston and New York, wealthy readers consumed these accounts while sitting in heated parlors. Their winter meant different social seasons, different fashions, perhaps some inconvenience when streets became muddy with melting snow. The northern winter described in their books was entertainment, a frisson of danger experienced safely through pages while sitting near a fire that servants had built and would maintain. These urban elites made decisions that profoundly affected frontier life without experiencing its realities. Investors in London determined company policies that governed what supplies would be sent to which posts, what prices would be paid for furs, what level of support officers would receive. Clergy in distant dioceses decided which missionaries would serve where, with what resources, for how long. Government officials in colonial capitals created land policies that either helped or hindered settlers, determined what infrastructure would be built, what services would be provided. They made these decisions based on maps and reports and economic theories, rarely informed by the actual texture of winter survival in the territories they governed. There existed then a whole chain of comfort descending from the warmth of London boardrooms through the relative comfort of company officers and missionaries down to the harder existence of settlers, and finally to indigenous peoples whose traditional territories and lifeways were being progressively constrained by the expansion of this colonial system. At each level, those above could claim they understood the hardships of those below, while actually insulated from them. Company officers had spent winters at posts, true, but winters in heated quarters with ample food. Missionaries had travelled through wilderness, true, but with support systems settlers lacked. Eastern investors had read reports, had studied maps, had perhaps even visited during summer months when the land seemed almost welcoming. But none of them, none except those who lived it fully without institutional support or escape routes, truly understood what winter meant to a family alone in a cabin, counting their remaining supplies, wondering if this would be the winter that broke them. The wealth that supported frontier privilege came, ultimately, from the land itself and from the labor of those who worked it most directly. Furs had value because trappers risked their lives in winter cold to harvest them. Land had value because settlers cleared and cultivated it. Company profits depended on indigenous hunters who understood the animals and the terrain better than any European. Yet the distribution of wealth from these resources flowed upward, concentrating in company coffers, in missionary institutions, in the pockets of investors who had never seen a beaver trap or felt the bite of 40 below cold. This is not unusual. It describes most economic systems most of the time. But the stark contrast between frontier hardship and frontier privilege gives it particular resonance. Consider a specific winter, say 1852, in London. Hudson's Bay Company shareholders meet in a comfortable hall, reviewing accounts. The company has had a good year. Fur prices are high. Expenses are under control. Dividends will be generous. The shareholders congratulate themselves on the soundness of their investment and adjourn to a fine dinner. At company headquarters in Lachine, near Montreal, Other officials manage the complex logistics of the trade. They work in heated offices, consulting ledgers, writing instructions to distant posts. They earn good salaries, live in solid houses, enjoy access to all the amenities of urban life. At a trading post somewhere in the Athabasca region, an officer lives in relative comfort, managing the local trade, corresponding with superiors. His greatest hardship might be boredom, the social isolation of living among people he considers inferior. In a cabin half a day's journey from that post, a settler family huddles around a failing fire, stretching their last supplies, hoping spring comes soon. They have trapped some furs, which they'll trade at the post, but the prices offered will barely cover the cost of the supplies they need. And farther out still, an indigenous family whose ancestors hunted these lands for centuries before any Europeans arrived tries to navigate a world increasingly constrained by company control of resources, by settler expansion into traditional territories, by the invisible lines being drawn on maps in distant offices. Each of these groups might claim to understand winter, but their winters are fundamentally different. For the shareholders, winter is a line in a ledger affecting supply and demand. For the officials, it's a logistical consideration, making transport more difficult. For the officer, it's a source of mild discomfort and ennui. For the settler, it's an existential challenge that consumes every waking thought. For the indigenous family, it's both a familiar seasonal reality and an increasingly complicated struggle as traditional resources become less accessible. The interesting question is not whether this hierarchy existed. Hierarchies always exist. The interesting question is how people at different levels understood or misunderstood their relationships to each other. Did company officers recognize that their comfort depended on the labor and hardship of those below them? Some probably did, though recognition doesn't necessarily produce change or guilt. Others likely believed they earned their privilege through their own merit, their education, their organizational skills. The system rewarded them for those skills, and the system seemed natural, inevitable, the way things ought to be. Did settlers resent the privilege they saw at trading posts and mission stations? Some surely did, feeling the unfairness of watching others live comfortably while they struggled. Others might have seen it as aspirational. Perhaps they or their children might climb into those privileged positions someday. Still others might have seen no alternative, accepting hierarchy as the structure within which all life occurred. Indigenous peoples had the most complex relationship to this system. Some worked for the company, traded with it, sent their children to mission schools, attempting to navigate the new reality and find some security within it. Others resisted, maintaining traditional lifeways as much as possible, viewing the entire colonial apparatus with suspicion or hostility. Most probably did some combination of both, pragmatically engaging when necessary, while trying to preserve what they could of older ways. The missions presented their own particular complications. They offered real help, food in times of hunger, medicine for the sick, education for children. But this help came with expectations, conversion, attendance at services, conformity to European moral standards, acceptance of the missionary's authority. For desperate people, especially during harsh winters, these expectations might seem a small price to pay for survival. But they were not small. They represented the slow erosion of traditional cultures, the replacement of one worldview with another, the creation of dependencies that reduced autonomy. A winter scene at a mission might include this. Inside the mission church, a service is underway. The missionary leads prayers in a language that some of the indigenous attendees barely understand. They stand and kneel at prescribed moments, echoing responses they've learned by rote. After the service, there will be food, soup, bread, tea, and this is why many come, because hunger is immediate and theology abstract. The missionary, in his warmer rooms after the service, writes in his journal about the souls he is saving, the light he is bringing to darkness. He feels satisfaction, even joy in his work. He believes he is helping, and in some ways he is, but he cannot see, or chooses not to see, the costs of his help, the ways it reshapes the people he serves. Back in eastern cities, mission societies publish newsletters celebrating these conversions, these civilizing efforts. Donors give money, feeling virtuous, imagining they are helping distant peoples become better versions of themselves. The newsletters don't mention the coercion inherent in offering food to the hungry only in the context of religious services. They don't mention the destruction of traditional spiritual practices, the shame attached to old beliefs, the ways children taught in mission schools learn to see their parents' ways as backward and wrong. The territorial administrators, governors, land agents, surveyors, operated with yet another form of distance. They created policies that sounded reasonable in offices but proved impossible or harmful in practice. They surveyed land into precise rectangular plots that ignored actual topography, actual resources, actual use patterns. They created regulations about hunting and trapping that made sense from a European legal perspective, but bore no relationship to how people actually lived in the territories being regulated. These officials generally meant well. They saw themselves as bringing order to chaos, rationality to wilderness, proper governance to ungoverned spaces. That the spaces were not actually ungoverned but had their own systems of order didn't register, or registered only as evidence of why proper European governance was needed. Consider the survey system applied to Western territories, neat squares of land, each the same size, ready to be allocated to settlers. On paper, this seemed efficient and fair. In reality, it meant some squares contained good soil and water, while others were useless. Some were accessible, while others were impossibly remote. It meant traditional territories used by indigenous peoples for seasonal hunting were carved up without regard for the patterns of movement those territories supported. Settlers who arrived to claim their surveyed plots sometimes found them unusable, too rocky, too wet, too far from water. But the system offered no flexibility, no acknowledgement that land is not uniform and cannot be treated uniformly. So families struggled to make unsuitable land productive, or abandoned their plots and moved illegally to better sites, or gave up and returned east with stories of frontier failure. The administrators who created this system never saw these consequences. They worked from maps, and on maps the system looked perfect, rational, organized, modern. That it failed to account for reality was reality's problem, not the system's. All of this created a profound disconnect between those who made decisions and those who lived with the consequences. The disconnect was maintained by distance, geographic distance certainly, but also social distance, economic distance, imaginative distance. Those in power could not or would not truly imagine what life was like for those without power. This failure of imagination had costs. Policies that might have eased frontier hardship were not enacted because decision-makers didn't understand the need. Resources that could have been distributed more equitably were not because those controlling distribution didn't see inequality as a problem. Systems that harmed vulnerable people continued because the harm was invisible to those with power. Yet calling this failure might be too generous. Failure implies trying and falling short. In many cases, there was no real try, just an assumption that the existing hierarchy was natural and proper, that those at the top deserved their comfort, and those at the bottom deserved, or at least had no right to complain about, their hardship. There were exceptions. Some company officers felt genuine responsibility for those under their authority, using their position to help rather than exploit. Some missionaries truly cared about the people they served, respected indigenous cultures, tried to provide support without demanding conformity. Some government officials recognized the gap between policy and reality and tried to close it. But these were exceptions. The system itself didn't encourage such behavior and often punished it. An officer who was too generous with company resources might find himself replaced. A missionary who respected indigenous spirituality too much might be recalled by his superiors. A government official who questioned policy might find himself sidelined. So the hierarchy persisted, and with it the geography of comfort and hardship. Winter came each year and touched everyone, but it touched some as minor inconvenience and others as life-threatening trial. And the difference was determined largely by factors, birth, position, wealth, that had nothing to do with worthiness or virtue. We have travelled through the long winter now, you and I. We have felt the cold through the eyes of those who endured it, not as a season, but as a way of life. We have sat in draughty cabins and counted our remaining supplies. We have walked with Susette through her decades of quiet persistence. We have tried to decipher the meanings hidden in ancient cash pits. We have seen how comfort and hardship coexisted, separated by nothing but the accidents of birth and position. What strikes us now, perhaps, is not the hardship itself, though that was real and profound, but the way people carried it. They did not think of themselves as heroes, did not imagine they were doing anything remarkable. They simply lived day after day through circumstances that required everything they had. There is something deeply human in this. We think of history as being made by great figures, famous names, dramatic events. But most of history is made by people whose names we'll never know, who did what needed doing, who endured what needed enduring, who kept fires alive through long, dark nights and called it simply Tuesday. The frontier families we've walked alongside tonight were not saints. They could be stubborn, could be narrow-minded, could participate in systems that harmed others. Settlers pushed into indigenous territories and rarely questioned their right to do so. They sometimes viewed the original inhabitants of the land as obstacles rather than people with their own deep connections to these places. But they were also human in their struggle, recognizable in their fears and hopes. A mother worrying about her children's cough, that emotion crosses all boundaries of time and culture. A person lying awake, wondering if supplies will last until spring. That anxiety speaks to something universal about uncertainty and vulnerability. The indigenous peoples who taught settlers like Susette how to survive, who worked for the company, who navigated the impossible position of watching their world change while trying to maintain their place in it, their story is part of this winter too, though we glimpse it mostly through the records left by others. Their knowledge made survival possible for newcomers. Their labor powered the fur trade. Their land became the frontier. Yet in most historical accounts, they appear as background, as context, rather than as full participants in their own story. This is a failure of the historical record, a gap that cannot fully be filled. We can acknowledge it, try to read between the lines, seek out the indigenous voices that do exist, but much remains unrecoverable, lost to time and to the way history gets written by those with power. The cash pits hidden beneath snow and soil remind us of this. They hold knowledge we can only partially recover. We see the technique, but miss the full meaning. We find the objects, but not the intentions. History is like this, always incomplete, always requiring us to acknowledge what we don't and can't know. As for the privileged ones, the company officers and mission directors and distant investors, their comfort was built on a system that depended on others' hardship. This is not unusual in history. Comfort is almost always built this way, extracted from those with less power, justified by narratives that make inequality seem natural or necessary or even beneficial. But recognizing this doesn't require us to hate them as individuals. They were also products of their time, operating within systems they likely didn't question because those systems worked well for them. The interesting thing is not their moral failure, but their blindness, the way privilege insulates people from seeing the full cost of their comfort. Now tonight, we sit in our own comfort. The heat that warms us requires only the adjustment of a thermostat. The food we eat comes from stores that never run empty, from supply chains so complex and reliable we barely think about them. We are separated from winter in ways Susette could not have imagined. This separation has costs. We lose certain kinds of knowledge, certain forms of resilience. We lose the deep attention to season and weather that people developed when survival depended on reading such signs. We lose the intimacy with necessity that comes from having no buffer between yourself and the natural world. But we gain obvious things too. We gain comfort, safety, the ability to focus our energy on concerns beyond mere survival. We gain the luxury of lying in warm beds, listening to stories about cold, feeling grateful for the distance between past and present. And perhaps that's enough for tonight, to feel that gratitude, to honor those who endured what we don't have to endure, to carry their stories a little farther into the future before we set them down and sleep. The frontier families, with their drafty cabins and frozen water buckets, with their endless wood-cutting and their monotonous meals, with their isolation and their stubborn persistence, they made it through. Winter after winter, they kept their fires alive. And because they did, because they endured, we are here now. Their struggles shaped the land we inhabit, the nations that formed, the infrastructure that eventually spread across territories that once seemed impossibly remote. Towns grew where trading posts stood, roads followed trap lines. The frontier pushed ever farther until it finally dissolved, replaced by something neither wilderness nor civilization, but somewhere in between. Susette's diary survived, carrying her voice across centuries. The cache pits remain, holding mysteries beneath the soil. The hierarchies that shaped frontier life transformed but didn't disappear. They echo still in how we organize society, how we distribute resources, how we decide whose comfort matters most. But tonight, we're not trying to solve these larger questions. Tonight, we're simply trying to rest. The images we've carried of frost-covered walls and frozen breath, of families huddled under buffalo robes, of the endless work of keeping winter at bay, these can drift now, can soften into the background. Imagine yourself warm, finally deeply warm. The cold that pressed on you for so long has lifted. Your fingers don't ache, your breath doesn't cloud, your body doesn't have to fight just to maintain itself. Imagine spring arriving slowly, impossibly, slowly at first, and then suddenly everywhere at once. The ice on the lake breaks with sounds like thunder. The snow melts in rushing streams. The first green appears, tentative at first, then bold. Birds return. The sun climbs higher in the sky and stays longer. Warmth becomes something you can trust again. Imagine the relief of that moment, the deep exhale after months of holding tension. Imagine how the survivors must have felt, exhausted but proud, diminished but still standing, ready to begin the cycle again, because what else could they do? We carry something of their stubbornness, their refusal to surrender. It's in us, somewhere, that capacity to endure, even though we rarely need to call on it. It's a legacy passed down through generations, a quiet knowledge that humans can survive remarkable hardship if they must. But we don't have to tonight. Tonight, we can simply drift, letting the stories settle, letting the images fade. The cold is a memory now, safely contained in words. The hunger is abstract. The fear is distant. You are warm. You are fed. You are safe. The fire, metaphorical now, or perhaps real if you have a fireplace, burns steadily, requiring nothing from you. The darkness outside is held at bay by walls and warmth and the accumulated infrastructure of modern life. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Feel the softness of your bed, so different from straw and rope and buffalo hide. Feel the gentle weight of blankets that don't smell of smoke, that don't need to be piled 6 deep to keep you alive. Listen to the quiet. Not the profound, pressing silence of wilderness, but the gentle hum of climate control, distant traffic, the small sounds of a world that doesn't threaten. Breathe easily. Your breath doesn't fog, your lungs don't burn from cold air. You don't have to calculate whether getting up will cost more heat than you can afford to lose. The frontier families would marvel at this world you inhabit. They would find it almost unbelievable that such comfort exists, that winter can be so thoroughly defeated, that survival can be so easy it barely registers as survival at all. They worked and struggled and endured so that someone, someday, might have easier lives. They didn't think of it in those terms, they were just trying to make it through another day, but the result was the same. So sleep now. Sleep warm and safe and comfortable. Dream, if you dream, of spring coming early. Dream of fires that tend themselves, of food that appears without effort, of cold that can be defeated with the turn of a dial. The winter of 1852 or 1847 or 1860, those winters are over. They ended long ago, survived by people whose determination we can barely comprehend. What remains is memory, stories, the archaeological traces of cache pits hidden in forest soil. And tomorrow, when you wake, the cold will still be at a distance. Winter will be manageable, perhaps even beautiful in its way. The struggles of the frontier will remain where they belong, in history, in story, in quiet recognition of how far we've come. Rest now. The fire is banked. The cold is kept at bay. The night will pass as nights do, and morning will come gently, without requiring anything of you but waking. Sleep well. Sleep warm. And if you drift through dreams that smell of wood smoke and pine, that carry the echo of wind through frozen trees, let them pass gently. They are only memories now. They cannot hurt you. They can only remind you of what came before, of how others lived, of the price that was paid for the warmth you now take for granted. Good night. Rest easy. The winter, this winter, and all those winters past, is finally yielding to sleep.